They knew where he was. That's the detail that makes this case different from most wilderness disappearances. There was no mystery about which forest, which drainage, which general area to search. Ray Ellwood's last known position was documented. The direction he had been moving was documented. The time frame was documented. Search coordinators had everything they normally spend the first 48 hours of a wilderness search trying to establish. They had it from the beginning, and they still couldn't find him. The search for Ray Ellwood ran for 14 days in the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest of north-central Washington state. It involved, at its peak, more than 200 volunteers organized in systematic grid teams. It involved 3 separate tracking dog deployments from different facilities. It involved aerial thermal imaging on 6 separate occasions, including 2 overnight flights, when the contrast between body heat and cold ground air is highest. It involved a forensic tracker brought in from out of state, who was given the full case file and 6 days in the field. The search area was not vast wilderness, with no reference points. It was a defined section of mixed timber and rocky terrain, bounded on 2 sides by roads, on 1 side by a river, and on the 4th side by a ridge that investigators had assessed as unlikely to have been crossed, given the circumstances. A defined area. Bounded. Known. 200 people. 14 days. Nothing. Not a boot. Not a piece of clothing. Not a discarded food wrapper. Not a footprint past the last confirmed location. Ray Ellwood had been in that forest, and then the forest kept him. That is what the search record shows, and the question that 14 years of subsequent investigation has not been able to answer is the same question the search coordinator stood with on the last day of the active operation, looking at maps that showed a fully covered search area with nothing inside it. How does someone disappear in a place that has already been searched? Ray Ellwood was 62 years old when he disappeared on September 28th. He had spent 40 years hunting and hiking in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. He was not a casual outdoorsman. He was the kind of person who knew the difference between an area you visit and an area you know. The Okanogan-Wenatchee had been his primary territory for 15 years. He had hunted specific drainages. He had named sections of terrain by their features, the way people name the rooms of a house they've lived in for a long time. His wife, Janet, told investigators that Ray had an observational relationship with the forest that she found difficult to describe to people who hadn't seen it. He noticed things, changes in the vegetation that indicated water or game, sound patterns that told him what was moving and where, the quality of light through timber that told him the time without looking at a watch. She said, "He didn't experience the forest the way most people do. He was in conversation with it." His hunting partner of 21 years, a man named Paul Kettrick, had a more operational description. He said Ray was the best woods reader he had ever hunted with. Not the most aggressive hunter, not the most physically capable, the best at understanding what the forest was telling him. On September 28th, Ray drove to a trailhead in the Methau Valley drainage of the Okanogan-Wenatchee and entered the forest at approximately 7:20 in the morning. He was doing a solo day hunt, something he had done hundreds of times. He carried a radio he used to stay in contact with Paul, who was hunting a separate section of the same general area. At 9:47 a.m., Ray made radio contact with Paul. He gave his position, a ridge section he called the White Timber area, which Paul knew from their years of hunting together, and said he had seen elk sign. He said he was going to work the draw below the ridge. Paul acknowledged. They agreed to check in again at 1 in the afternoon. At 1, there was no contact. At 1:30, Paul tried again. At 2, he started moving toward the White Timber area. He found nothing. No Ray. No sign of Ray. He called search and rescue at 3:45 p.m. The search began that evening. The first night's search was organized around the White Timber Ridge and the draw below it, the area Ray had described in his 9:47 transmission. Searchers moved through the terrain with headlamps, calling Ray's name, using signal lights, listening for any response. The forest was quiet, not the quiet of an empty wilderness, September in the Okanagan. Wenatchee has other hunters, other hikers, other people moving through, but the forest produced no response to the search team's calls, no answering light, no whistle, no radio transmission. By dawn, the Okanagan County Sheriff's Office had formally activated a major search and rescue operation. By 8 in the morning, 60 volunteers were staged at the trailhead. Search Coordinator Dana Reese had been running wilderness operations in that region for 17 years. She later described the initial situation as one that should have been manageable. She said, "We had a last known position from a radio transmission an hour and 45 minutes before he was reported missing. We had a specified terrain feature, the draw below the White Timber Ridge. We had reasonable weather. We had good volunteer numbers. We had a defined geographic boundary on 3 sides. On paper, this was one of the more tractable scenarios I had worked. On paper. By the end of day 1, the draw below the White Timber Ridge had been covered. Teams had walked the ridgeline above it. Teams had worked the drainage at the bottom. No Ray. No sign. On day 2, the search expanded. The boundaries that Dana Reese had initially assessed as limits, the roads on 2 sides, the river on a 3rd, were confirmed as realistic constraints, because crossing any of them would have left evidence that searchers checked for specifically. No one had driven away from the area. No one had waded the river. The roads had been monitored from the time the search was initiated. Ray was in the forest. The forest simply wasn't giving him back. Tracking dogs arrived on day 2, brought from a facility in eastern Washington. They were given Ray's scent from his vehicle, clothing from the back seat, a hat from the console. They confirmed scent at the trailhead and tracked Ray's path up toward the White Timber Ridge. The handlers later described the dog's behavior on that initial track as what they called high-confidence work. The trail was clear, the scent was strong, the terrain, while mixed, was workable. They followed Ray's route up the access trail, through a section of open timber, and onto the lower section of the ridge. At a point approximately 40 minutes of hiking from the trailhead, a location consistent with where Ray would have been during his 9:47 transmission, the dogs began to work more intensively, circling, returning, working the area. The handlers interpreted this as a location where Ray had spent time, had stopped, had been present. From that point, the dogs tried to continue and showed an inconsistent pattern. Not a clean end point, like a scent trail that simply stops. Something more complex. They pulled in multiple directions, showed interest in several possible routes, and couldn't commit to a single continuing track. The lead handler wrote in her report, "Subject appears to have moved through this area without settling into a clear directional track. Scent evidence is distributed in a pattern consistent with a subject who was present, moved, stopped, moved again. Unable to establish a clean, continuing track from this location. Unable to establish a clean, continuing track." That description, that picture of Ray in the area of his last transmission, moving, stopping, moving, in a pattern the dogs could detect but not resolve into a direction, became the central problem of the search. He was there. The dogs were sure of that. But where he went from there, the dogs could not say. The second dog deployment on day 5 used a different team and a different approach. They were started from a point further back in the trail to establish whether the first team's work had contaminated the scent environment. The second team reached the same area on the ridge and showed the same inconsistent pattern. On day 8, a third team was brought in from a facility in Oregon. Different state, different animals, different handlers. Fresh scent material was obtained from Ray's home, where his wife provided items that only Ray had handled. The third team tracked to the same location, the same inconsistent pattern, the same inability to resolve a direction. 3 independent dog teams across 8 days, all arriving at the same conclusion. Ray had been at that location, moving without settling, and they could not tell the search team where he had gone. Donna Reese would later say that the dog behavior, consistent across 3 independent teams, was one of the most operationally significant findings of the search. Not because it explained anything, because it established, with reasonable confidence, that Ray had been present in that specific area after his 9:47 transmission, and that something about his movement pattern in that area was unusual enough to prevent the dogs from resolving it into a trackable direction. What that meant, what Ray was doing in that area, why his movement produced that pattern, and where he went, the dogs could not say. The search continued without a directional track to follow. The dogs knew Ray had been there. The dogs couldn't say where he went. And the question that would define the next 13 days settled in. How do you find someone in terrain you're already standing in? Day 4 produced the first significant complication to the search's operational framework. A volunteer team working a section of the White Timber Draw found something in the soil at the base of a large Douglas fir. A boot print. Single impression. Right foot. Clear enough to photograph and measure. The tread pattern was compared to casts taken from Ray's spare boots in his vehicle. The comparison was consistent. 1 boot print, in the draw below the ridge, in approximately the area where Ray had described heading after his 9:47 transmission. This was encouraging. It was evidence. It told the search team something they didn't have before. Ray had been in the draw, at that specific location, at some point after his last radio contact. The team marked the location and expanded the search around it. They worked the surrounding terrain carefully, looking for additional prints, for disturbed vegetation, for any indication of direction. They found nothing else. 1 boot print. No preceding prints leading to it. No following prints leading from it. A single impression in the soil, as if Ray had placed his foot there once, and the earth had recorded it. And that was all. The forensic tracker who arrived on day 6 examined the boot print carefully. He noted that the soil conditions around it, The moisture content, the texture, the degree to which surrounding vegetation had been compressed were consistent with the print being made within the 48 to 72-hour window before his examination, which placed it within the time frame of Ray's disappearance. The tracker then examined the surrounding terrain for additional sign. He spent 2 full days in the draw and the ridgeline above it. His report noted that he found no other sign he could attribute to Ray's passage. He found animal sign, deer, what he assessed as a black bear, various small mammals. He found what he identified as a faint human disturbance in the vegetation approximately 30 feet from the boot print, an area where ground cover had been slightly compressed, possibly by a person, possibly by a large animal resting. He could not determine which. He noted in his report, the boot print establishes subject presence in this location. The absence of additional sign within a 48 to 72-hour window is unusual for a subject moving through this terrain under normal circumstances. Either the subject moved without leaving recoverable sign, or the subject did not move further from this location in a manner that left recoverable sign. Either Ray had moved without leaving sign, or Ray had not moved further. Both possibilities were deeply uncomfortable. If Ray had moved without leaving sign, he had somehow traversed terrain in a manner that an experienced forensic tracker could not detect. If Ray had not moved further from that location, if he had stopped at that boot print and remained in the immediate area, then 200 people had searched that area and not found him. Neither explanation resolved cleanly. On day 7, a development that the search coordinator described later as one of the most difficult moments of the operation. A helicopter conducting an aerial sweep of the draw, using thermal imaging equipment in the late evening when the air temperature contrast was favorable, returned a reading, a thermal signature. In the lower section of the draw, approximately 150 yards from the location of the boot print. The signature was small, ambiguous, not the clear human-shaped heat return that would indicate a living person in good condition, but something. A reading that the equipment operator logged as warranting ground investigation. Ground teams were sent to the location the following morning. They found a rocky depression, a section of the draw where the slope leveled into a small flat area, sheltered by a fallen log on one side and dense brush on 2 others. It was the kind of spot, one searcher noted, where a person who was injured or disoriented might naturally stop. It offered shelter from wind. It was at the bottom of the slope, which is where people moving without full awareness tend to go, downhill, following gravity. There was no one in the depression. There was no physical evidence in the depression that they could attribute specifically to Ray. The thermal reading remained unexplained. The equipment operator filed a notation that the reading could have been residual heat from an animal, from decomposing vegetation, from a geological feature. He noted that a reading of that type in that terrain was not conclusive of anything. It had been worth checking. It had produced nothing. And it had raised a question that Dana Reese logged carefully in the case file. If the thermal equipment detected something in that location and ground teams found nothing, what did the equipment detect? That question has no answer in the case file. The witnesses were few. This was September in a working forest. not the high-traffic environment of a national park or a popular trail system. But investigators found 3 people who had been in the area during the relevant period and whose accounts were logged in the case file. The first was a hunter named Marcus Cole, who had been working terrain on the far side of the White Timber Ridge on the morning of September 28th. Marcus had been on the opposite slope from where Ray was hunting, and he told investigators he had heard a rifle shot at approximately 10:15 in the morning. 1 shot. He hadn't paid it particular attention. It was deer season, shots were routine. But he noted the direction as being consistent with the draw below the White Timber Ridge. Investigators checked Ray's rifle when it was later recovered from his vehicle. It had not been fired. If Marcus Cole heard a shot from the direction of the draw at 10:15, it was not from Ray's rifle. Who fired it, and at what, was not established. Another hunter in the area, working terrain that wasn't mapped as part of the active hunting zone, could account for it. But no other hunter in the area came forward to acknowledge being near the White Timber draw at that time. 1 shot, not Ray's, unaccounted for. The second witness account came from a woman named Sandra Freeth, a birder who had been working the lower drainage below the draw on the morning of September 28th. Sandra was not a hunter and had been in the area for a specific observation project. She was precise and methodical in her note-taking, traits that made her a useful witness. She told investigators that at approximately 11 a.m., she had seen a man on the slope above her position. He was in the lower section of the draw, moving downhill, away from the ridge. She described him as wearing camouflage, medium build, moving at what she characterized as an irregular pace. Not a smooth downhill walk, but something more hesitant. She said he stopped twice while she watched, for no apparent reason, and stood still before continuing. When investigators showed Sandra photographs, she said she could not make an identification. The distance had been significant, but the build and the clothing were consistent with Ray Ellwood, a figure moving downhill in the draw at 11 a.m., moving irregularly, stopping without apparent reason. If that was Ray, he had been alive and mobile at 11 in the morning, nearly 2 hours after his last radio transmission. He had been moving downhill, toward the lower section of the draw, toward the area where the boot print would later be found. And he had been moving strangely. Investigators asked Sandra to elaborate on the irregular movement. She said the man seemed uncertain, not in the way of someone who had twisted an ankle or was physically impaired, more like someone who was unsure of where they were going, taking steps, and then reconsidering, moving, and then stopping without an apparent external reason for stopping, like a person whose internal navigation was not working the way it normally would. That description, the account of a man moving through familiar terrain as if he was uncertain of his own direction, became one of the most analyzed details of the case. Was it a medical event? A cardiac episode that was affecting his cognition before it fully took hold? A sudden neurological event that was disrupting his spatial awareness before he went down? Or something simpler, exhaustion, dehydration, the accumulated effects of a long morning in terrain that was more demanding than it looked? The search could not answer that question. Sandra Freeth saw what she saw, and then the man on the slope was out of her sight, and she returned to her birds. And that was the last anyone appears to have seen Ray Ellwood. The third witness account was the one that investigators found most difficult to categorize. A man named Leonard Bautista, who had been riding an ATV on a Forest Service road at the southern boundary of the search area on the afternoon of September 28th, told investigators he had seen a person walking on the road, not in the forest, on the road, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. Leonard described the person as adult male, wearing camouflage, walking south along the road, away from the search area, away from the trailhead where Ray's vehicle was parked, walking south on the road at 2:30 in the afternoon. Investigators showed Leonard photographs of Ray. Leonard said he couldn't be certain. He had been moving on the ATV, and the encounter was brief. But he said the person he saw was alone, didn't acknowledge him as he rode past, and appeared to be walking with purpose in a southward direction. Here is what made Leonard's account difficult. If it was Ray, he had been alive at 2:30, walking on a road, apparently aware enough to be moving purposefully. But Ray had been reported missing at 3:45. If he was on the road at 2:30, he should have been findable. The road was accessible. His vehicle was known. His destination was known. And if he was on the road at 2:30, where did he go in the next hour and 15 minutes that prevented Paul from finding him at the trailhead and Gary from encountering him as the search began? Alternatively, if the person Leonard saw wasn't Ray, then the road had been used by another person in camouflage that afternoon, someone who had been in the general area of the search without coming forward to provide a witness account. Investigators followed up on Leonard's account carefully. They could not confirm or eliminate it. It was logged, and it remained one of the unresolved contradictions in the case file. By day 10, the search had been reconfigured multiple times. The original probability zones, built around the White Timber Ridge and Draw, had been exhausted and recovered. The search had expanded south, east, north. It had covered terrain outside the original bounded area on the assessment that the initial constraints, while reasonable, might have been wrong. Dana Reese described the expanding search as operationally necessary and psychologically difficult. Every expansion meant acknowledging the prior coverage might have missed something. Every expansion that produced nothing meant the probability of finding Ray diminished. "The forest doesn't shrink," she said. "It stays the same size. But your confidence in your ability to find someone inside it changes." On day 11, a development that briefly redirected the search's focus, a team working a section of terrain east of the original search area, terrain that had been assessed as low probability because it required crossing a road that had been monitored since day 1, found a piece of equipment, a folding knife, in the soil at the edge of the tree line. The knife was examined and compared against descriptions of Ray's gear. Janet Ellwood confirmed that Ray carried a folding knife. She described its general appearance, a particular brand and model, with a distinctive handle coloring. The knife found on day 11 was not the same brand. It was not the same model. The handle color was different. The knife did not belong to Ray, but it had been in the search area. Someone had been in that section of terrain with a folding knife and had lost it or discarded it. Someone who was not Ray. Investigators noted it. They could not exclude the possibility that another person had been in that section of the terrain during the relevant period, a person who had not come forward. It was logged as an unexplained presence. The terrain east of the road was added to the coverage area. Ray was not found there either. On day 14, Dana Reese made the call to scale back the active search. 14 days. A defined area that had been covered at high density multiple times. No result. She said in her closing summary, "The search of the terrain associated with Ray Ellwood's last known position and the expanded search area that followed was conducted with available best practices and was as thorough as resources allowed. The failure to locate the subject is not attributable to inadequate coverage of the identified terrain. The subject is not in the areas that were searched. The subject's location remains unknown. The subject is not in the areas that were searched." That sentence, the operational conclusion of a 14-day, 200-person search, is also the most precise statement of the mystery. If Ray is not in the areas that were searched, where is he? Let's go back to the forest itself. Dana Reese described the search terrain using a specific analogy. She said, "People think searching a forest is like searching a room. You look in every corner. But a forest isn't a room. A forest is a room where the furniture keeps moving, and some of the furniture is the same color as the floor. And when you shine a light into a corner, sometimes the corner folds in a way you didn't expect." She said the terrain had a quality she called depth. You could look at a section and believe you had seen it clearly, and discover, when you walked through it, that what you had seen was a surface with hidden features that weren't visible until you were on top of them. She said, "Covering an area on a map and actually seeing every square foot of that terrain are not the same thing." That gap between the map and the ground. The problem with this theory is Leonard's account. He described the figure as walking with purpose in a southward direction. Purpose, in this context, would suggest orientation, someone who knows where they are going. Not the irregular, hesitant movement Sandra Freeth had described an hour and a half earlier. Either something had changed between 11 a.m. and 2:30 p.m., or the two witnesses had seen two different people, or one of the accounts was inaccurate. None of those options resolves cleanly. The third theory is the one that investigators are always required to consider, that another person was involved. Ray's personal life, when examined, showed no significant conflicts. His marriage was stable. His finances were unremarkable. His relationships in the hunting community, described by Paul Kettrick in detail, showed no antagonism. The unaccounted rifle shot at 10:15. The unaccounted person on the road at 2:30. The folding knife that belonged to an unidentified person in the search area. 3 data points that suggest another person or persons in the relevant terrain during the relevant time. None of those points is individually significant. All of them together represent a pattern of unaccounted presence that investigators could not resolve. Foul play was formally examined and formally left open. No evidence supported it conclusively. No suspect was identified. The case remains classified as a missing persons investigation. Every theory has a gap, and in every gap, the same question returns. How do you find someone in a place you've already searched? Where is Ray Ellwood? Ray Ellwood is not the only experienced outdoorsman to disappear in a forest that was subsequently searched without result. David Politis, whose documentation of wilderness disappearances spans more than a decade of public records, research has identified cases where searches were conducted, subjects were not found, and subsequent events established. The subject had been in the searched area all along. Remains discovered months or years later in terrain search records show was covered. These cases produced ongoing discussion in the search and rescue community about what coverage actually means in complex terrain. Dana Reese has participated in those discussions. She said reviewing them permanently changed how she thought about what her teams were doing. She said, "We say we searched an area, and we did search it. But what we can say, accurately, is that we moved through it. We used our eyes and our instruments and our dogs. We applied everything we had. But an experienced forensic tracker once told me that there are 4 kinds of forest: the forest you can see, the forest you can hear, the forest you can smell, and the forest that exists in none of those categories." He said, "Search teams operate in the first 2. The rest of it, we're hoping doesn't have who we're looking for." The forest that exists in none of those categories. That is not a supernatural statement. It is an operational one. It describes the genuine limitation of search methodology in terrain where micro-features create concealment invisible from a path 5 feet away. Ray Ellwood was in that forest. The forest kept him. Not because of anything mysterious, because the forest is complicated, layered, indifferent to the urgency of the people moving through it, looking for one specific person. Even for the people who know it best. Even for Ray Ellwood. 2 cases to establish that Ray's disappearance is not isolated in the specific feature that makes it most difficult to accept. The first is Alan Patterson, 57 years old, who vanished from the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest of Washington State in October of 2007. An experienced hiker and forager, reported missing when he failed to return from a solo day trip. A 9-day search covered his planned route. Alan Patterson was found 14 months later. Found by a hunter working terrain the search records showed had been covered on day 3. The recovery location was approximately 200 yards from a path that a search team had walked. 200 yards of brush and fallen timber that had been assessed as checked from the path. It had not been entered. That is not a failure of method. That is the forest doing what the forest does, presenting a surface that appears covered while holding something inside that the coverage didn't reach. 200 yards. And the question that hangs over it. How do you find someone in a place you've already looked when the looking wasn't as complete as the map suggested? The second case is Peter Holloway, 64 years old, who disappeared from the Colville National Forest of northeastern Washington in September of 2014. A retired biology professor with extensive field experience, conducting a solo plant survey he had done in that forest many times. An 11-day search covered his survey route. Peter Holloway has never been found. What his case shares with Alan Patterson's and Ray Ellwood's is the same central fact. A defined area assessed as covered, an experienced person who was not found inside it, and no adequate explanation for where they were, if not in the searched terrain. The search and rescue community has grappled with these outcomes for years. Better GPS tracking of team paths, more systematic coverage documentation, aerial imaging to identify hidden terrain features. All of it has improved methodology without eliminating the fundamental problem. A forest is not a room. It does not yield its contents simply because you walk through it. And sometimes, in the cases that stay in search coordinators' files and family members' minds for years. What the forest holds is the person you are looking for, and the forest keeps them. Ray Ellwood's case is still open. Okanagan County maintains the file. The case has been reviewed twice since the initial investigation, most recently in 2021. The 2021 review identified no new leads. It did note, in its summary, that 3 areas within the original search zone had received coverage that, by current documentation standards, was assessed as incomplete. Not unsearched. Covered, but not at the density that current protocols would require. Those 3 areas were identified. The review recommended additional ground coverage of those specific sections. As of the most recent information available, that additional coverage has not been conducted. Janet Ellwood, Ray's wife, has continued to press for research of those sections. She told a regional newspaper in 2022 that she was not asking for a miracle. She was asking for 40 years of experience in the forest to count for something, for the areas that were noted as incompletely covered to be covered completely. She said, Ray knew that forest. He would have wanted people to be honest about where they actually looked. If there are places they didn't fully look, go look. That's all I'm asking. Paul Kettrick has organized 3 private searches since the initial operation. He has worked with forensic trackers, with dog handlers, with retired search and rescue personnel who volunteered their time. He has covered terrain that the initial search didn't reach at full density. He has found nothing. He goes back every fall. Not in September. He won't be in that forest in September anymore. But in October, when the light is different, and the undergrowth has thinned, and you can see a little further into the timber. He goes back and walks the white timber draw and the ridge line above it. And he looks, he said in a conversation with the reporter who covered the initial search. I've had 14 years to think about what happened in there, and I keep coming back to the same thing. Ray knew that forest. He knew it better than I did. If there was a place in that draw to be safe, to wait, to hunker down, he would have found it. And if he found it, and it was somewhere we couldn't see from the path, then he's in there. Still in there. In a place we walked past and didn't enter. He paused. The forest kept him. I just haven't figured out where. Here is what the case record shows. Ray Ellwood made a radio transmission at 9:47 a.m. on September 28th. He described his position and his plan. 14 years later, that transmission remains his last confirmed communication. A witness saw someone matching his description in the draw below the white timber ridge at approximately 11 a.m., moving irregularly, stopping without apparent reason. A tracking dog deployment across 3 independent teams established that Ray had been present in the area of his last transmission and had moved in a pattern that could not be resolved into a clear direction. A single boot print confirmed his presence in the draw. A thermal reading on the 6th day of the search suggested possible residual heat in the lower section of the draw. Ground investigation found nothing. A witness reported seeing a figure in camouflage on the southern access road at approximately 2:30 p.m. Not confirmed as Ray. Not eliminated. A rifle shot at 10:15 a.m. was attributed to an unidentified source in the area. Not Ray's rifle. A folding knife was found in the search area. Not Ray's. The 14-day search covered the defined terrain and found nothing. A subsequent review identified sections of the original search zone that received incomplete coverage by current standards. Additional coverage has not been conducted. Ray Ellwood has never been found. Not in 14 days of organized search. Not in 3 subsequent private searches organized by Paul Kettrick. Not in any of the subsequent fall seasons when Paul has walked the White Timber Draw alone. The forest covered an area that was searched repeatedly by people who knew what they were doing. And somewhere inside that searched area, in the forest that Dana Reese described as having depth that search methodology doesn't fully penetrate, Ray Ellwood is the answer to a question that nobody has been able to ask in exactly the right way yet. How do you find someone in a place you've already looked? That is the question the search left behind. That is the question Paul Kettrick walks into the White Timber Draw every October trying to answer. The forest doesn't answer it. The forest just stands there. Mixed timber and ridge. Draw and drainage. 3 dimensions of complexity in a terrain that looks, from the outside, like a place that should have given up its secret by now. It hasn't. Ray Ellwood entered it on a September morning 14 years ago, and the forest swallowed him, and the forest has kept him, and the forest is still there.